Welcome, dear friends, and welcome back to another peaceful journey through history. Tonight, we step gently into a world shaped by whispers, shadows, and quiet secrets. A medieval world where rumors traveled faster than horses, where monks guarded hidden letters, where healers met under moonlit branches, and where kings could vanish like mist. Together, we'll wander through dim corridors, forgotten libraries, silent forests, and lantern-lit marketplaces, uncovering the hidden truths that shaped the past in ways few ever realized. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for supporting this little corner of calm storytelling. If you enjoy these soft journeys through forgotten ages, please consider subscribing and joining our growing, peaceful community. Your presence truly means more than you know. Settle in, breathe deeply, and let the flicker of torchlight guide your imagination. And when the final chapter ends, relaxing music will begin, carrying you gently toward rest. Night in the medieval world did not arrive quietly. It seeped into the land like a slow-moving tide, softening sounds, deepening shadows, and stirring the old fears most people pretended not to have. In the dim glow of torches flickering against wooden beams, life narrowed into a small circle of light. Everything beyond it became uncertain. A territory ruled not by reason, but by rumor. To walk through a medieval village at dusk was to step into a place where imagination and reality mingled freely. The shoemaker locking his door a bit too quickly, the baker whispering to his wife near the oven, the shepherd lingering by the well longer than necessary. All of them carried the same tension in their shoulders. They had inherited it from generations before them. The belief that the world was full of secrets, and that danger rarely announced itself plainly. Superstition shaped daily life as surely as the seasons did. People did not explain strange events with logic, because logic was a luxury few possessed. Instead, they relied on stories, whispered accounts of unexplainable happenings passed from grandmother to grandchild, from weary traveler to curious innkeeper. If a lantern blew out for no reason, the villagers muttered about wandering spirits. If the hens stopped laying eggs, someone would inevitably blame a curse. And if the local noble rode by with an unusual guard at his side, the entire tavern would murmur theories before the ale even settled in their cups. The markets were no better. In daylight, they bustled with noise and color. But even then, whispers traveled faster than coins. A merchant might lower his voice to share that a neighboring town had seen mysterious footprints near the forest edge. A potter might swear that the wind carried voices at night. A farmer might lean in close and reveal that he had seen a stranger by the crossroads who vanished the moment he turned away. None of these stories were proven. None needed to be. Whispers thrived because information was scarce. Most people lived their entire lives within a handful of miles. News from distant places arrived slowly and often changed shape along the way, like a traveling actor slipping into new costumes. A small argument in one town turned into a rebellion 3 villages later. A sickness affecting 2 households became a plague somewhere farther down the road. A noble family dispute transformed into talk of treason, curses, and dark omens. Fear filled the spaces left empty by truth. Beyond the villages, in the larger halls where nobles held courts, the whispers were no less potent, only more polished. Behind carved wooden screens, servants leaned in to trade secrets about alliances forming in distant counties. Messengers brought news that sounded half-believable at best, and the nobles themselves, draped in velvet and pride, played their own quiet games of suspicion. In those high stone rooms, lit by chandeliers that swayed ever so slightly, uncertainty became its own form of currency. Even the church, with its solemn chants and tall towers, contributed to the culture of whispers. Priests spoke of omens of signs sent from above, of trials meant to test faith. The people listened, unsure whether to be reassured or afraid. An eclipse might send half a village hiding behind closed shutters. A snowfall out of season became a divine warning. And when lightning struck the steeple of a chapel, no one slept comfortably for weeks. Across the land, rumor wove itself into daily living. It shaped conversations, guided choices, and created invisible lines of caution that everyone quietly respected. A path that seemed perfectly harmless during the day suddenly became forbidden after sunset, Because a story told by someone's cousin's cousin warned of strange lights seen there. A stream the children once played beside became untrustworthy after a traveler claimed to hear unnatural sounds near it. Whispers created a world where everything had a meaning, even if that meaning was invented in the moment. And because of this, conspiracies grew like vines, twisting through every settlement, every castle, every lonely road. Some were harmless, tales meant to pass long winter nights. Others carried sharp edges, capable of turning neighbor against neighbor. In a world dimly lit and full of unknowns, secrecy thrived, and so did fear. Together, they shaped medieval life far more deeply than any king, bishop, or scholar ever could. In the medieval world, a king's greatest danger was not always found on the battlefield. It often waited for him in the quietest place of all his dining hall. Inside those grand chambers, where tapestries shimmered in torchlight, and servants moved with rehearsed grace, every meal was a silent test of trust, and trust, for a ruler, was as fragile as an egg. The royal table, with its polished silver cups and steaming platters, appeared serene to the untrained eye. But beneath the surface, tension curled like smoke. For a king, each sip and spoonful carried the weight of unseen risks. Not because the food was exotic or rare, but because ambition, jealousy, and resentment traveled just as easily through kitchens as armies did across borders. Royal kitchens were bustling worlds of their own, noisy, warm, and always smelling of spices that only the wealthy could afford. Dozens of cooks, bakers, and scullions hurried between fires and tables, their hands coated with flour, oil, or soot. But for all the motion, each face carried the same awareness. A single mistake could be interpreted not as but treason. Some kings ate cautiously, sitting straight-backed, their eyes flickering to the goblet or plate as though expecting it to whisper its secrets. Others pretended not to worry, laughing loudly at feasts, but signaling guards with the slightest twitch of a finger whenever something new was brought to them. The longer a king ruled, the more practiced these gestures became. Food testers stood nearby, often dressed simply despite their important role. Their task was straightforward: taste everything before the king did. It was a strange kind of honor, respected, feared, and avoided by most. A tester woke each morning, uncertain whether he would end the day with praise or a hurried burial. Some joked, half-heartedly, that surviving dinner counted as a promotion. Others never joked at all. Yet despite the fear that hung over the royal table, the most interesting truths often came from the kitchen staff themselves. They saw everything: who entered the halls unannounced, who whispered with the steward, who argued in the corridors when they thought no one was listening. Servants were the quiet watchers of royal life, and their knowledge was worth more than coin. Some kings rewarded loyalty generously. Others ruled through an atmosphere so tense that even innocent mistakes seemed suspicious. Feasts were the most dangerous occasions of all. Long trestle tables groaning under roasted meats and sugared fruits gave the illusion of safety. Laughter boomed off stone walls. Musicians performed melodies that twined through the air like intricate ribbons. Yet behind this spectacle, the king remained keenly aware that power made him a target. Nobles toasted cheerfully, but their smiles sometimes held too many teeth. Visiting dignitaries offered gifts with hands that trembled just slightly. The king's cup was refilled constantly, and each refill carried its own question. Political rivalries sharpened the tension. A courtier denied a promotion might suddenly offer the king a newly baked pastry from his personal cook. A noble recently punished for disloyalty might still send a barrel of wine to restore goodwill. Even personal feuds among servants created risks. A disgruntled baker could accidentally burn bread, or deliberately add something far worse. Not every fear was justified. Many kings spent their entire lives without facing a real attempt on their plate. But superstition and caution wove themselves so deeply into royal habits that suspicion became second nature. A king might dismiss a dish simply because its smell reminded him of a bad omen he heard as a child. He might avoid drinking from a golden cup because a long-dead ancestor once fell ill after using one. Still, the royal table endured. Meals were served day after day, despite the unseen dangers, because rulers understood a paradoxical truth. Refusing to eat in public made them seem weak, A king survived by projecting strength, even if he tasted fear beneath every bite. And so the rituals continued. The tester's careful sip, the steward's nod. The king's composed first bite, each action part of a silent performance that kept the Roma's heart beating. In T's world, the act of eating was never merely nourishment. It was politics. It was theater. It was trust wrapped in ritual, and beneath the grand hall's flickering torches. Every spoonful carried a story that only those closest to the royal table ever understood. The medieval forest was more than a stretch of trees and rustling leaves. It was a boundary between the known and the mysterious. Villages might end where the last cottage leaned toward the sun, but the forest began where certainty faded. To step beneath its canopy was to enter a world where whispers drifted like mist and shadows sometimes seemed to breathe. By day, the woods offered simple things. Firewood, herbs, wild berries, a place for children to chase each other as their parents collected fallen branches. Birds sang brightly from treetops. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, painting the forest floor with shifting patterns. Even the cautious villagers admitted the forest was beautiful then. But once the sun dipped below the hills, everything changed. The wind grew cooler, slipping between trunks like a sly messenger. Owls called from unseen branches, their voices echoing like warnings. The same paths walked comfortably in daylight became narrow corridors of darkness. And in that darkness, people believed ancient secrets stirred. Many of those secrets were whispered from parent to child. Tales made to explain strange sounds or unusual lights. But some stories had roots deeper than memory. Old rites practiced long before kings. Knights, or priests, laid claim to the land. Peasants ventured into the forest on certain nights, especially around the changing of the seasons. They carried small bundles of herbs, little carved tokens, and bundles of bread or fruit meant as offerings. They gathered under oak trees so old their roots resembled sleeping beasts. No one spoke loudly. No one used names. Everything was quiet, respectful, as though they were guests in a home, not their own. These gatherings were not sinister. The villagers prayed for healthy livestock, safe births, good harvests, and mild winters. They lit tiny fires that flickered like stars fallen to earth. They sang in low voices, melodies passed down not through books, but through memory. For them, the forest was not a place of evil. It was simply a place where the old world still breathed. Still, the church feared such rituals. Priests worried that these ancient customs were remnants of beliefs they hoped would fade. They preached against unsanctioned gatherings, warning that spirits or devils might masquerade as familiar comforts. But to the villagers, the forest offered reassurance. The stone church could not. It felt alive, responsive. In hidden clearings, healers also met quietly. Women who knew the curing power of willow bark, mint, elderflower, and comfrey often shared knowledge beneath the moon as a gentle glow. They whispered remedies for fevers, poultices for wounds, teas to calm anxious hearts. To many villagers, these healers were blessings. Their care saved lives when physicians were distant luxuries. But to the authorities, the forest became a suspicious place when knowledge passed without permission. Secrets moved too freely there. Too many people trusted the old ways more than the approved ones. Moonlit circles formed most often in spring and autumn. The air was cool but fragrant, with earth and blooming things. People walked barefoot so their footsteps would not disturb the spirits they believed watched over the woods. A gentle hush always fell over the clearing, not because anyone demanded silence, but because the forest itself seemed to close in and listen. Sometimes the gatherings were interrupted. A patrol of guards, convinced they would uncover some forbidden ritual, might arrive with torches blazing. But what they found were simple folk, frightened and confused, clutching herbs and candles, performing traditions older than memory. More often than not, the guards retreated, realizing they had stumbled not upon conspiracy, but upon quiet devotion. The deeper parts of the forest were avoided, even on sacred nights. Villagers believed that the heart of the woods belonged to itself, to the creatures that wandered freely, to the ancient trees, to whatever forces lingered beyond human understanding. Even the bravest hunters spoke in hushed tones of a clearing where no birds ever sang, or of a spring whose water stayed warm even in winter. The forest guarded its own mysteries. To outsiders, these gatherings and stories might seem foolish, but in a world shaped by uncertainty, the forest gave people a sense of connection to the land, to each other, and to the unspoken truths they felt rather than understood. Under those towering trees, lit by moonlight and firelight, villagers carried out traditions that made them feel part of something older and larger than themselves. And so, night after night, season after season, the forest remained a sanctuary for secrets, a quiet refuge where whispers could be spoken without fear, and where the ancient world, if only for a moment, still lived. At first glance, a medieval monastery seemed like the quietest place in the world. A refuge wrapped in stone walls, where the only sounds were turning pages, distant bells, and soft footsteps along echoing corridors. Travelers approaching such a place often imagined peaceful prayers drifting through stained glass windows and monks tending gardens under the sun. And yes, such serenity existed. But beneath it, another world thrived, a world built on information, discretion, and the silent gathering of truths. Monasteries were the crossroads of knowledge. Long before news traveled by paper or printing press, it traveled by people. And no people traveled more quietly, more purposefully, or more observantly than monks. A monk on the road drew little suspicion. He carried no weapons, required no payment, and created no fear. People spoke more freely around him than around nobles or soldiers. And so, without ever asking, monks heard things. Fragments of stories, rumors whispered at roadside inns, confessions from anxious villagers, passing comments from merchants hurrying to the next town. Upon returning to their monastery, these quiet travelers brought back something far more valuable than the herbs or books they collected. Information. Inside the cloister, knowledge flowed like an underground river. Priors and abbots listened with calm expressions, but behind that calm lay strategy. Messages from far-off regions were compared to what had been heard locally. Patterns were noticed. Dangers were anticipated. Alliances were tracked. A king might learn of a distant rebellion only after weeks of waiting. A monastery might learn of it in days. The monks did not think of themselves as spies. They believed they were simply keepers of wisdom, protectors of order in a world where chaos could rise swiftly and without warning. Their ears were open because someone had to listen. Their hands wrote carefully because someone had to record. Indime scriptoria. Candles burned late into the night, as scribes copied letters containing everything from political tensions to weather patterns, from noble disputes to suspicious troop movements. The handwriting was delicate, precise, and always restrained. The margins told the true story. Coded notes, small symbols, abbreviations only a few in the monastery understood. Information was never written plainly. The wrong eyes could turn a simple observation into an accusation of treason. Monasteries sent letters almost as often as they received them. A messenger might depart at dawn, carrying a scroll hidden within his sleeve, appearing to the world as nothing more than a gentle brother delivering blessings to nearby villages. Only he and the abbot knew that the message he carried could change the course of a noble dispute or warn an allied cloister of danger creeping silently through the region. There were networks, two quiet connections between monasteries hundreds of miles apart. Though they prayed differently, lived differently, and served different lands, their need for information bound them together. When famine threatened one region, warnings traveled through these networks like flickering sparks. When war loomed, monks exchanged signs and coded greetings, ensuring that news moved faster than armies. Even kings respected these networks, for they knew the monks held eyes and ears everywhere. But no network was perfect, and not all monasteries shared the same intentions. Some became entangled in noble politics, supporting one family over another. Others used their knowledge to bargain for land, privileges, or protection, and a few, very few, acted with whisper-thin motives. Trading secrets like coin, influencing events through subtle nudges, and carefully withheld information. Within the cloister walls, silent observers watched everything. They noticed when a noble arrived, with too many guards, when a messenger seemed nervous, when an unfamiliar merchant lingered near the gatehouse. Their observations were not written down but stored in memory, recalled only when needed. To outsiders, monasteries were places of simplicity and prayer. But to those who understood the deeper currents of medieval life, they were hubs of quiet intelligence, guardians of knowledge, interpreters of rumor, and watchers of the fragile peace that stretched across the land. Their power was subtle, never displayed openly, but felt everywhere like a shifting breeze. And so, behind stone walls and under-arched cloisters, monks continued their quiet work. Their quills moved softly, their eyes stayed sharp, and their whispered knowledge shaped the world far more than anyone realized. There was a time in medieval history when ordinary soldiers walked the roads, but certain men rode with an air so heavy, so carefully guarded, that villages fell silent the moment they appeared. These were the members of the secretive knightly orders. Brothers bound not only by vows, but by layers of tradition, ritual, and silence so deep that even kings struggled to pierce them. In a world of lords and warriors, these orders stood apart. They answered not to the usual chains of command, but to their own councils, their own codes, their own shadows. Some orders were formed to guard dangerous roads. Others were created to escort pilgrims or defend forgotten borders. A few existed for reasons no one quite understood. Their true purpose whispered about only in the quietest corners of taverns. Whatever their mission, each order carried an aura of mystery. Their symbols carved on shields looked familiar yet unreadable, as though hiding meanings seen only by those who had sworn their oaths. Their armor was often plain, but always carefully maintained. It shone not with luxury, but with discipline. Their horses were trained to travel swiftly and tirelessly, as though they knew secrets too. The wealth of these orders astonished many. Though they owned no personal property, the Brotherhood itself possessed sprawling lands, fortified strongholds, and treasure chests filled with coins from distant kingdoms. Donations poured in from nobles seeking protection, from merchants hoping for safe passage, from travelers grateful for lives saved along the way. And because the orders operated as their own entities, unbound by feudal laws, their influence stretched across borders in ways few rulers could match. Kings tolerated them, admired them, and feared them in equal measure. Ordinary people often caught only glimpses of their activities. A line of armored riders moving through fog at dawn, torches flickering along the walls of a remote fortress, a cloaked figure meeting quietly with a local lord before vanishing into the night. These sightings sparked rumors that the orders hid relics of unimaginable power, that they guarded ancient secrets, that they shaped conflicts from behind the scenes. Inside their fortress walls, the Brotherhoods held councils in chambers lit by oil lamps rather than sunlight. Their meetings were conducted with a stillness so profound that even the air seemed to hesitate. Maps stretched across long tables, marked with coded symbols only the Order understood. Letters arrived sealed with wax so thick it cracked like ice when broken. Visitors were rare, and those allowed entry left with expressions that betrayed nothing. Every member lived under strict vows: obedience, discretion, loyalty. A knight's life belonged not to himself, but to the Order. Even his past became a quiet thing, tucked away behind his oath. Some came from noble blood, others from humble farms, but once the white, gray, or crimson mantle was placed upon their shoulders, their previous lives blurred into insignificance. Training was relentless. Days began before sunrise with silent drills in the courtyard. Blades clashed, shields thudded, breath misted in the cold air. Afterward came studies, history, codes, languages, and the intricate cipher scripts used to send secret messages to allied strongholds. No knight rose through the ranks without mastering both sword and mind. But it was the rituals that fascinated outsiders most. At dusk, the Order gathered in the chapel, the flickering candlelight reflecting off rows of armor. Their chants were low, steady, and strangely soothing ancient words, promising devotion to duty, protection of the innocent, and secrecy beyond death. No member spoke of what happened during initiations. Those who endured them carried a solemn look 4 days afterward, as though they had glimpsed something they were now bound never to reveal. And yet, despite all the whispers surrounding them, most of these knights lived not for glory, but for purpose. Their brotherhoods offered structure in a chaotic world. Their routines created certainty in uncertain times. Their secrecy, though intimidating to many, kept them focused and unified. Some orders faded with the passing centuries, their fortresses crumbling into Avikavid ruins. Others evolved quietly into new forms, still guarding roads, borders, and mysteries. But in their time, they were among the most powerful groups in Europe, disciplined, silent, and utterly devoted. And for those who crossed paths with them, the memory lingered. A glimpse of glinting armor, a crest half seen, a line of riders disappearing into the dusk, carrying their secrets with them into the deepening night. Illness in the medieval world did not arrive quietly. It crept into villages like an invisible fog, settling into corners and drifting down narrow lanes long before anyone noticed. A single cough in a marketplace, a fever in a distant hamlet. A child too tired to play, these small signs were often dismissed at first. But as days passed, the whispers began. And once whispers began, fear was never far behind. Without the knowledge we hold today, sickness felt like a force beyond human understanding. Villagers believed it traveled with the wind, or hid in dark corners, or rode on the backs of night spirits. Some swore they saw a pale figure wandering the fields before an outbreak. Others blamed old wells, strange animals, or punishment from above. Everyone had a theory. No one had an answer. Authorities rarely acted quickly. News of illness reached them slowly, carried not by trained officials, but by frightened travelers or merchants who had seen too much. By the time a message arrived at a noble's hall or a city gate, the sickness might already have spread. The people asked for guidance, yet the leaders hesitated, unsure whether the danger was real or merely rumor. In this gap between uncertainty and action, fear grew into something sharp. Messenger riders were the first to sense the shift. They moved from village to village, delivering letters sealed in wax, their horses' hooves stirring dust along empty lanes. The bravest riders continued their routes even when families refused to open doors or speak from closer than a window's width. The riders saw things no one else wished to describe. Abandoned carts left in roads, shuttered homes even on bright afternoons, and quiet fields where even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. Monasteries, isolated by design, suddenly became safe havens. Their thick walls and controlled routines kept sickness from entering as monks closed their gates, limited travel, and prayed endlessly for the world outside. In their scriptoria, they copied older texts detailing past outbreaks, not because those texts offered cures, but because they offered patterns. Monks believed that knowledge, even incomplete knowledge, was a lantern against the dark. Inside these stone sanctuaries, monks kept lists of symptoms, marked maps of affected areas, and recorded the movement of travelers. They did not use the word research, but that is what it was careful. Observation in a time when panic threatened to drown reason. They noticed which villages emptied quickly, which remained untouched, and how sickness sometimes seemed to follow certain roads more than others. Yet even within these fortified walls, not all was peaceful. When merchants sought refuge, carrying goods and coins, but possibly carrying illness as well, abbots had to decide between charity and safety. Some welcomed them, believing compassion was worth the risk. Others kept their gates barred, torn between duty and fear. Outside the monasteries, common folk relied on folk practitioners whose knowledge came not from texts, but from generations of experience. Women with herb bundles tied at their waists brewed teas of yarrow, mint, or elderflower to ease fevers. They burned smoke through homes to cleanse the air. They whispered prayers as they mixed ingredients, not because they understood infection, but because they understood suffering. Still, not everyone trusted them. In times of fear, people often looked for someone to blame. A healer who succeeded one week might be accused the next. A midwife who saved mothers 4 years might suddenly find townsfolk whispering behind her back. Fear changed nothing about her skills, only the world's willingness to listen. As sickness spread, villages grew strangely quiet. Workshops closed. Churches stopped ringing bells, except to mourn. The usual sounds, laughter, market calls, children's games, were replaced by the soft, haunting echoes of grief. Yet beneath this blanket of fear, something else quietly unfolded. Resilience. Families cared for one another in ways they never had before. Priests and monks walked dangerous roads simply to comfort the living. Healers worked until exhaustion blurred their vision, and messenger riders though terrified, continued delivering letters because someone had to keep communication alive. When illness finally passed, it left behind scars, empty chairs, abandoned homes, and memories people wished they could forget. But it also left behind wisdom. Every outbreak taught communities something: how to prepare, how to protect, and how to listen to the signs of approaching danger. In a world without scientific certainty, medieval people relied on a mixture of courage, tradition, and quiet observation. Their knowledge was imperfect, but their determination was unmistakable. And in those dim, fearful months, the world learned once again that even in the darkest times, human resilience flickers like a candle. Fragile, yes, but beautifully steady. Monasteries were, in the eyes of most villagers, places untouched by shadows. Their bells rang with steady reassurance. Their gardens blossomed with herbs and fruit, and their walls seemed built more for peace than for protection. But anyone who lived near one long enough sensed something deeper beneath the calm, not darkness. Exactly. But how weight a seriousness, a silence that felt sharper than prayer alone could explain. Within those stone cloisters moved men who had devoted their lives to contemplation, yet devotion did not erase human nature. Among the monks were the gentle-hearted, the scholarly, the humble, and, quietly tucked among them, men whose pasts were not quite as peaceful as their robes suggested. Some of these were lay brothers, men who had come seeking refuge from old debts, old enemies, or old sins. They were given simple tasks in the monastery: tending fields, repairing roofs, carrying grain from cellar to kitchen. The other monks asked no questions, and the newcomers offered no stories. But the past has a way of lingering, even in holy places. These lay brothers often carried themselves with attention that did not belong in a place of prayer. Their steps were lighter, as though they had once needed to move silently. Their eyes scanned more carefully, as though always expecting someone to appear behind them. And when disputes arose, even ordinary ones about chores or harvest distribution, their tempers flared with a suddenness that startled the gentler brothers. Not all were dangerous, of course. Many had come simply to leave their troubles behind, but the truth remained. The monastery was a sanctuary not only for the pious, but also for those who sought to hide from the world's gaze. Nobles understood this better than villagers. A lord in trouble could retreat to a monastery and claim sanctuary. Rival nobles bristled at this, frustrated that the walls kept them from settling old scores. There are records, though whispered and incomplete, of nobles sending agents disguised as servants, scribes even wandering pilgrims into monasteries, not to pray, but to watch, to listen, to wait. These spies blended easily among the masses of travelers who passed through monasteries each year. Many offered to help in the fields. Some volunteered in the kitchens or at the gates. A few spent their days sweeping corridors, unnoticed by monks whose focus lay elsewhere. And so, beneath their sacred roof, a subtle tension simmered. Not enough to disturb prayers, but enough that perceptive monks felt something coiled behind the daily rhythm. And then there were the debts. Monasteries often lent money to nobles, merchants, and even small villages. When repayment faltered, trouble followed. The monks rarely confronted debtors directly. Their vows forbade violence. But certain lay brothers, with their shadowed pasts and quiet skills, sometimes appeared in the right place at the right time, reminding lords of obligations they had conveniently forgotten. A missing horse returned. A stolen parcel reappeared. A troublesome rival withdrew a claim, all without a word from the abbot. It was easy for outsiders to imagine these lay brothers as hidden daggers of the monastery's silent enforcers, who carried out tasks the more pious brothers preferred not to acknowledge. Whether this was true or merely rumor hardly mattered. The belief alone was enough to give monasteries an aura of quiet power. Inside the walls, monks continued their peaceful routines, chanting at dawn, tending bees, illuminating manuscripts with careful strokes of ink and gold. But every so often, one might notice a shadow slip across the courtyard at an hour when no one should be awake. A door might close with an unusual click. A cloaked visitor might leave before sunrise, escorted discreetly through a side gate, and the monks would say nothing. They understood that their sanctuary was built on more than scripture. It was built on the trust of nobles, the fear of wrongdoers, and the unspoken pact between those seeking redemption and those offering refuge. To break the silence would threaten the balance that had protected the monastery for generations. So the prayers continued. The gardens flourished, the bells rang, and in the spaces between those peaceful moments, secrets moved with quiet steps, unseen, unspoken, but always present. Like daggers sheathed beneath humble robes, in many medieval villages, the first person a family turned to when illness struck was not a physician. Most had never even seen one, but a healer who lived just beyond the edge of the settlement. Her home, whether a small cottage or a hut half swallowed by climbing vines, was easy to recognize. Bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, dried flowers tied in loops above the door, a faint scent of smoke and wild plants drifting through the air. These women were known by many names: wise women, herb wives, midwives, rude gatheries. But villagers spoke of them with a mixture of respect and caution. Their knowledge felt older than the stone churches, older even than the border markings carved by kings. It had been passed down through generations, from mother to daughter, from teacher to apprentice, through hands that learned by touching leaves, not turning pages. Their skills were practical. They knew which herbs cooled fevers, and which caused them, which roots eased childbirth, and which soothed a warrior's wounds. They could tell from the color of a leaf whether it had grown in too much sun or too little, and from the taste of a flower whether it would cure a cough or send someone into a deep, unsettling sleep. No one understood plants as they did, because no one listened to the earth quite so closely. Yet their wisdom was not written anywhere. It lived in memories, in whispered lessons shared while grinding powders or stirring brews over an open fire. Because of this, Circless, small gatherings of healers who met under the moon or beside quiet streams, felt secretive even when they intended no harm. These meetings were calm, almost ritualistic. A handful of healers would gather at dusk, each bringing herbs from her region: lavender from the dry hills, feverfew from the river banks, wild garlic from hidden forest patches. They spread their findings on blankets or smooth stones, comparing colors, scents, and textures. They shared stories: a difficult birth saved by a brew of raspberry leaves, a strange illness soothed by mint, a mysterious wound that refused to heal until an old remedy was remembered. They learned from one another because they had to. Illness did not respect borders, nor did childbirth, or wounds, or grief. And so these circles, though unrecognized by officials, became a quiet, vital network of shared knowledge. But the church and authorities viewed them with suspicion. Priests preached that healing should flow from prayer, not plants. Nobles feared anything outside their control, and those in power noticed that the healer's influence ran deep. Deeper than law, deeper than rule. When a woman could cure a fever that frightened even a knight, her authority grew in ways no lord could easily suppress. Accusations rose in tense times. If a crop failed, some villagers blamed unseen curses. If a child died unexpectedly, grief sometimes twisted into fear, fear into anger, and anger into accusation. A healer who had been welcomed into homes for decades could suddenly find shutters closed to her, whispers following her steps. The same hands that had delivered hundreds of babies might now tremble as she walked the village path under watchful eyes. Still, the healer circles persisted, moving quietly and carefully. When the moon was thin as a thread, they met deeper in the woods. When suspicion grew in one village, gatherings shifted to another. Sometimes they sent small gifts with travelers' pouches of dried herbs, tied with colored thread, bearing no names but understood by those who needed them. Their wisdom saved countless lives. It guided mothers through long nights of labor. It soothed fevers in winters, colder than memory. It healed cuts from farm tools, bites from animals, burns from cooking fires. And even in places where they were feared, people still sought them out. When trouble came, fear bends easily, but desperation bends even more. Though they lived far from power, far from castles and cloisters, the healers shaped medieval life in ways history seldom records. They acted not through grand gestures, but through simple acts of care, placing cool cloths on foreheads, mixing teas, whispering reassurance in their hands. The old knowledge of the land flowed unbroken, generation after generation. And so, beneath moonlit skies, or within humble cottages, lit by tallow candles, the silent circles of healers continued their work. Steady, gentle, unseen. Their presence lingered like the scent of herbs in the night air. Subtle, comforting, and enduring. In the medieval world, where news traveled on weary horses and stories stretched like shadows at dusk, nothing captured the imagination more than the sudden disappearance of a ruler. Kings were meant to be immovable. Thrones did not simply sit empty. So when a monarch vanished, even for a day, the entire kingdom seemed to hold its breath. Sometimes a king disappeared in the chaos of battle. Other times, he slipped away during a hunting expedition, chasing a stag too far into the forest. And there were rare moments, whispered only when doors were closed, when a king vanished because he wished to. In each case, the absence felt almost unreal, as if the land itself were waiting for a heartbeat to return. Villagers reacted first, their voices rising in anxious clusters along market streets. A missing king meant uncertainty. Who would protect them? Who would collect taxes, settle disputes, or keep neighboring lords from growing too bold? Farmers walking along muddy roads paused to share rumors. Merchants whispered in wagons. Even children sensed the tension, falling quiet during games, when adults spoke too softly and too quickly. Yet the most intriguing stories came afterward, tales of kings who returned not as they had been, but changed, or perhaps not truly themselves at all. Pretenders appeared almost as quickly as the rumors. One might arrive with a confident stride, claiming he bore a childhood scar only the royal family would know. Another came with a ring said to have been gifted by a queen long dead. A third spoke the dialect of the royal court flawlessly, despite being raised far from noble lands. And in a world with few records, where portraits were rare and memories blurred over time, people listened and sometimes believed. A traveler, passing through taverns, might hear wildly different accounts. In one town, they swore the returning prince was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes like winter frost. In the next, villagers insisted he was slender and soft-spoken, with a distinctive way of holding his cloak. It did not matter that both descriptions could not possibly be true. People believed the version they needed most, the version that offered hope, order, or the return of a stable world. Courts struggled just as much. Counselors examined the supposed king with narrowed eyes, asking questions only a true monarch should know: the name of a childhood friend, the pattern on the old palace tapestry, the phrase a tutor once repeated during lessons. Sometimes the answers were perfect, unsettlingly perfect. Other times they were close enough to make doubt flicker, then fade. Did the pretenders truly believe their own stories, or had they practiced so long that the lies had become truths within their minds? Even the most seasoned lords found themselves uncertain. Yet among the many stories, a few held a strange, haunting consistency. The tale of the king who returned but acted differently. He remembered places no one had shown him. He forgot events he had once spoken of clearly. He walked the halls with a new stillness, as though listening to voices others could not hear. Servants whispered that his gaze lingered too long on locked doors or forgotten chambers. Some said he slept rarely, wandering the castle at night as though searching for something he had left behind. Was he changed by trauma, by illness, by fear, or in this idea kept many awake on cold nights? Was the returning king not the same man at all? Prophets and storytellers loved these tales. They spoke of enchanted woods that altered men's memories, of river spirits who replaced lost rulers with look-alike guardians, of bargains made in moments of desperation. Peasants listened with wide eyes, eager for mystery in a world filled with struggle. Nobles listened with narrowed eyes, wary of imposture in a world filled with ambition. And always, hidden beneath the stories, was the quiet truth that identity in medieval times was fragile. Few people had their faces written in books. Few had birthmarks recorded or voices described. A well-told story could be as convincing as a bloodline. So when kings vanished, truly vanished, the world did not simply lose a ruler. It lost certainty, and when they returned, the world gained something strange, something flickering between truth and illusion. For in those dim centuries, a crown was more than metal, it was belief. And belief, once shaken, could never fully settle again. In the medieval world, few things were as essential or as quietly feared as water. Wells dotted the landscape like dark, watchful eyes, offering life to the villages built around them. People drew from them each morning, their buckets creaking on ropes worn by years of use, the cold water reflecting the sky like a perfectly still mirror. Yet, despite this familiarity, wells held a reputation that made even the bravest villagers pause at night. A well could give life, but just as Izali, Tevilibed, it could take it away. Most villages had at least one well whispered about in hushed tones. Some said the water tasted odd at dawn, as if the night had seeped into it. Others claimed the wind made unnatural sounds when it passed across the opening. There were stories of animals refusing to drink, of lantern light dimming when lowered down the shaft, of reflections in the water that seemed a heartbeat too slow to follow the person looking in. These small, uncertain signs were enough to spark the imagination of people already accustomed to living in a world where the unknown lurked behind every stone. Fear around water was not baseless. Contamination was common, though villagers lacked the knowledge to explain why. When sickness struck several households at once, minds turned quickly toward the well. They imagined curses, angry spirits, or old grudges stirring beneath the earth. Neighboring villages blamed one another, especially when streams ran between disputed borders. A barrel of murky water that once might have been dismissed as unlucky now became proof of sabotage whispered about in dimly lit taverns. Children heard these tales long before they understood them. They learned not to play too close to wells or lean over them, even during bright daylight. Mothers would gently tug them back, murmuring warnings that were never fully explained. It was not uncommon for a child to believe a hand might rise from the darkness, or a voice might echo faintly from below. The well was a place approached with respect and a hint of dread. Some wells earned reputations that lasted generations. A stone placed slightly askew, a rope that frayed faster than expected, or a bucket that swayed when no wind blew. These small details grew into legends. Families spoke of wells cursed by ancient quarrels, by forgotten wrongs, or by tragedies so old no one remembered the names involved. People avoided these wells except when absolutely necessary, and even then moved quickly, refusing to meet their own reflection in the water. Priests sometimes blessed wells, sprinkling holy water into them and murmuring prayers meant to soothe anxious communities. Villagers watched with hopeful eyes, but their fears did not always ease. A blessing could quiet superstition for a season, but one unusual sound in the night might bring those fears back stronger than before. Wells, after all, were deep places, and medieval minds believed deep places held the memory of the earth. When drought struck, the fear grew sharper. As water levels dropped, the walls of the wells revealed stones, long hidden from view, each one seeming to open a new story. People whispered that drought uncovered old curses, exposing whatever had been sealed away by time. Buckets returned lighter, ropes scraped against stone, and every sound echoed louder. Even those who scoffed at superstition felt a tightness in their chest when the rope creaked in the stillness of a dry summer. Travelers often brought tales of distant lands, where entire villages were abandoned because of a single well gone wrong. Perhaps the water had turned cloudy without reason. Perhaps a traveller had fallen ill shortly after drinking. Or perhaps no reason existed at all, and that was enough. Medieval people understood little of water's mysteries, but they recognized patterns. When fear rose in one village, it traveled easily to the next, spreading like ripples from a pebble dropped into calm water. Yet, despite all the dread, wells remained central to life. People drew from them each morning, letting the cold water wash sleep from their faces. They filled pots, fed animals, and continued the daily rituals that had sustained generations. Fear did not stop them. It merely accompanied them, a quiet companion standing beside the old stone rims. And perhaps that was why wells held such power. They were places where necessity met uncertainty, where life met mystery, where the everyday world dipped into the dark, silent earth, and returned with something essential yet never fully understood. In the gentle glow of dawn, or the quiet hush of night, villagers approached their wells with the same mixture of trust and caution. They knew the water sustained them, but they never forgot that beneath its calm surface lay depths no one had truly seen. In the medieval world, A person's identity was a fragile thing. Names were spoken more often than written. Faces were recognized more by memory than by record, and truth depended greatly on who was present to witness it. In such a landscape, identity could shift with surprising ease. Not because people wished to deceive, but because the world lacked the tools to anchor them firmly to who they were. Most villagers lived their entire lives within a day's walk of where they were born. To them, identity was simple. The baker's daughter, the shepherd's son, the traveling peddler with the crooked hat. But for those who moved beyond these familiar borders, soldiers, pilgrims, merchants, wanderers, the lines that defined a person began to blur. A stranger arriving in a market square might carry a name no one could verify, a story no one could challenge, and a past that drifted like a half-remembered dream. Claimants to thrones understood this better than anyone, with few portraits, no maps of bloodlines, and even fewer written records. A convincing voice and a steady gaze could be enough to sway uncertain nobles. A man who claimed to be the lost heir of a fallen house might present a childhood detail known only to a few. Another might display a ring said to have belonged to a royal ancestor. Whether these tokens were true or crafted hardly mattered. What mattered was that people were ready to believe. Belief, in a world hungry for stability, carried more weight than proof. Courts wrestled with this often. Counselors argued behind carved wooden doors, trying to decide whether a claimant's mannerisms matched those of the child they once knew. Servants whispered their own theories, recalling scraps of memory from years past. Every gesture, every hesitation, became evidence. A pause before answering a question could be read as deceit or as the natural uncertainty of someone returning to a life left long behind. Identity did not only shift at the highest levels of power. Ordinary people learned to navigate these uncertainties as well. A traveling craftsman could reinvent himself simply by arriving in a new village with new tools. A soldier discharged after a long campaign could adopt a new name to leave old wounds behind. And a runaway serf might live for years in another town, their old life fading like a shadow at dusk, without written documents or centralized records. A person's story depended on the words they spoke and the way they carried themselves. Sometimes this fluidity offered safety. Refugees fleeing war-torn lands might find refuge under borrowed names. Children orphaned by conflict could be claimed by distant relatives who simply insisted on kinship. In these quiet acts, identity served not as a fixed truth, but as a gentle bridge between survival and belonging. Yet this same fluidity could spark fear. Rumor spread icily in communities that guarded their stability fiercely. A stranger who arrived, knowing too much about local customs, might raise eyebrows. A traveler who resembled a long-lost relative might stir unease. People watched for inconsistencies. A slip of dialect, a habit unfamiliar to the region, a story told one way on one day and slightly differently on another. Some villages had stories of individuals who lived among them for years before someone realized their past was not what they claimed. These revelations were rarely dramatic. More often, they sank quietly into village gossip. The truth whispered first at water barrels, then passed from doorstep to doorstep. The person in question seldom denied the rumors directly. Instead, they continued their work, letting the whispers fade with time, knowing that even mistaken stories eventually settled like dust. Pilgrimages added another layer to this shifting landscape. Along the winding roads that stretched between shrines and holy sites, travelers shed layers of their old lives. Many walked with groups who knew nothing of their pasts. By the time they returned home, they carried new experiences, new scars, and sometimes new names. A pilgrim returning after a year or more often felt like both the same person and someone entirely different. In the end, identity in medieval Europe was not a solid foundation, but a softly shifting one. A mosaic pieced together through memory, belief, and the stories people told about themselves. A face could be forgotten, a detail misremembered, a voice mistaken in the dim light of a tavern. And in these spaces of uncertainty, people learned to navigate a world where truth was often a gentle negotiation rather than an unbreakable fact. Perhaps that was what made identity so precious. It was not merely a label or a lineage. It was a delicate tapestry woven from trust, shared history, and quiet acceptance. A tapestry that, once altered, could never quite be restored to its original form. In the medieval world, Knowledge was not something that drifted freely through the air. It was stored carefully, protected quietly, and guarded with a seriousness that often surpassed the reverence given to gold or land. Castles and monasteries were full of rooms, some open and bustling, others locked behind heavy doors, where manuscripts, scrolls, and forgotten fragments of ancient worlds rested in stillness. And it was in these hidden spaces that the true shadows of medieval learning lingered. In most settlements, books were rare enough to be spoken of the way one might speak of distant wonders. A single manuscript could take months or even years to produce, its pages smoothed with care, its ink mixed in small, precious batches. So when a monastery accumulated even a modest collection, it became a quiet treasure, one that few were allowed to see. Monks moved through these rooms with soft footsteps, the rustle of parchment echoing louder than their voices. They treated each volume as though it carried a living spirit, fragile and easily disturbed. Some libraries were open only to the most disciplined scholars. Their doors remained locked at all hours, the keys held by a single appointed guardian who carried them tucked beneath his robe like sacred relics. Even fellow monks approached him with caution, requesting entry in low tones, as though asking for passage into another realm. The guardian seldom refused, but he always watched closely as the visitor stepped inside, ensuring no hand lingered too long on any forbidden shelf. Forbidden shelves existed in nearly every monastic library. They were not always marked, yet everyone seemed to know which ones carried texts meant only for certain eyes. Some contained ancient treatises, copied from crumbling scrolls, their meanings only half understood. Others held writings considered dangerous works, exploring ideas that did not align with accepted teachings or observations that challenged the order of the world. These books were read rarely and discussed even less, yet they remained preserved, as though the monks believed that erasing them entirely would be a sin against memory. Castles, too, held their share of hidden rooms. Behind tapestries or beneath stairways, nobles kept personal archives filled with letters, contracts, and genealogies that shaped alliances and feuds. A misplaced document could shift the balance of entire regions. A letter discovered too late could reveal a betrayal long hidden. Servants told stories of nobles slipping into these rooms late at night, candles in hand, reviewing pages that determined the future of their lands. These visits were always solitary, always quiet, and always carried a weight of unease. Some hidden libraries were born of necessity. During times of conflict, monks stored fragile manuscripts in cellars or sealed alcoves to protect them from raiders or fire. Many of these hiding places were forgotten over time, leaving books slumbering in darkness for decades. Occasionally, a new abbot would order renovations, and workers would break through a wall only to find shelves untouched since the days of their great-grandfathers. Dust would rise in clouds, and the workers would step back instinctively, sensing they had disturbed something ancient and patient. There were also whispered tales, impossible to prove, but never fully dismissed, of rooms, intentionally concealed by clever design. A panel that opened only when pressed in just the right place. A narrow passage hidden behind rows of thick cloaks. A stairway that seemed to end at a blank wall but continued downward if one knew where to step. These secret chambers were said to contain manuscripts too precious or too troubling to be kept in the open, maps to forgotten lands, treatises on forbidden practices, or chronicles that contradicted accepted history. Few admitted to having seen such rooms, yet the stories persisted, woven into the fabric of monastic life. Even ordinary people sensed the presence of hidden knowledge. When a monk returned from years of study speaking more softly than before, villagers wondered what truths he carried that he dared not share. When a noble guarded a single chest more fiercely than all his gold, servants whispered guesses about the letters locked inside. And when torchlight flickered through a narrow window of a library long after midnight, those passing outside felt a strange mix of curiosity and distance, as though something within was calling, yet asking not to be approached. In these forbidden rooms and hidden libraries, the medieval world preserved not only its learning but its uncertainties. The knowledge locked within was not simply information. It was a reflection of fear, caution, and reverence. People believed that some truths were too powerful for daily life, that they belonged to quiet spaces where the air felt heavy and the shadows long. And so, behind wooden doors and beneath stone arches, knowledge slept, not lost, but waiting, wrapped in silence thicker than any cloak. Only a few ever entered these chambers, and fewer still understood the full weight of what lay within. For in the medieval world, secrecy was not merely protection. It was a way of honoring the quiet mysteries that shaped the unseen corners of life. Across the medieval landscape, beyond quiet villages and fortified manors, stood the small but fiercely independent city-states, places where stone towers rose like watchful sentinels, and narrow streets hummed softly with the rhythm of ambition. These cities rarely clashed on open battlefields. Instead, they waged gentler, quieter wars. Conflicts fought not with swords, but with letters, coins, and carefully timed whispers. Each city-state had its own character. Some sat beside rivers that carried trade for miles. Others perched on hillsides, protected by winding walls that seemed to grow out of the stone itself. Merchant families controlled much of the wealth, their banners fluttering from high windows, their palaces filled with cool courtyards and shaded halls. But beneath all this beauty lay a constant struggle for influence, a delicate balance that could tilt with the slightest shift in fortune. The rivalries began subtly. A merchant caravan delayed on a mountain pass. A shipment of grain mysteriously spoiled before it reached a market. A scribe miscopied a treaty, leaving a phrase open to dangerous interpretation. None of these incidents alone were enough to spark alarm, but together they whispered of hidden hands shaping events from behind the scenes. The citizens felt the tension, though they rarely spoke of it openly. They saw it in the cautious way traders greeted each other and in the silent looks exchanged between council members during public meetings. Diplomacy in these city-states was an art, practiced with elegance and unwavering patience. Envoys traveled along dusty roads carrying scrolls tied with silk cords, their messages carefully crafted to appear polite while revealing only what their senders wished to show. Behind closed doors, however, the true negotiations unfolded, slow, deliberate, and filled with pauses that carried more meaning than the words themselves. A single sentence delivered with too much emphasis could shift the course of months of planning. Merchant families often acted as the invisible generals of these silent wars. Their wealth allowed them to influence council decisions, sponsor expeditions, and forge alliances that reached far beyond the city walls. Some families specialized in storing grain, others in fabric, others in precious metals. All were intertwined in webs of interdependence and quiet rivalry. A single lost shipment could weaken a family for years, and competitors watched carefully for any sign of vulnerability. Sabotage rarely took the form of dramatic acts. Instead, it moved through the city like a soft breeze, unnoticed by most, but felt keenly by those who understood its patterns. A warehouse might receive fewer goods than expected. A bridge might develop a crack after years of use at just the wrong moment. A rumor, whispered first in a market stall, might grow legs and wander through the city until it reached the ears of a council member. None of these events could be traced back to a single source, yet they nudged the balance of power in subtle ways. The guilds played their own quiet part. Craftsmen, builders, blacksmiths, and masons held influence through their skills, and city-states relied heavily on their labor. When a guild withdrew its cooperation from a project, progress slowed to a halt. When it offered support, buildings rose swiftly, and trade flourished. Guildmasters understood their value, and they used it carefully, never quite stepping into politics, yet never truly remaining outside it. At night, the city-state seemed peaceful. Lanterns flickered along bridges, casting long reflections into calm waters. Merchants closed their shutters, and the sounds of workshops faded into silence. But those who stayed awake long enough could sense movement in the quiet. A council envoy leaving through a side gate, or a messenger taking a different road than expected. Letters disappeared into gloved hands. Coins exchanged quietly in shaded courtyards. Plans unfolded without a single weapon drawn. Despite the tension, life continued smoothly for most citizens. Bakers kneaded dough before dawn. Weavers worked their looms in sunlit rooms. Children played in squares where fountains whispered softly. The silent wars rarely touched them directly. They felt only the subtle shifts in mood, like changes in the weather. A festival might be postponed, a tax adjusted, a trade route rebuilt. These changes came gradually, allowing everyday life to flow gently forward. In the end, the city-states' conflicts were battles of patience rather than force. carefully maintained through diplomacy, caution, and an unspoken understanding that open war would destroy the delicate structures that kept each city thriving. The silent wars continued for generations, shaping alliances, guiding decisions, and weaving invisible threads through the lives of all who called those city-states home. And though travelers might pass through these cities unaware of the quiet struggles beneath their feet, the stones themselves seemed to remember holding the echoes of every whispered deal, every unseen rivalry, and every soft-footed messenger who had ever crossed their ancient paths. In the medieval world, lineage was a thread woven through every corner of life. Delicate, precious, and often stretched thinner than anyone dared admit. Bloodlines determined who inherited land, who commanded authority, who held the right to speak in council halls or kneel before a throne. Yet for all their importance, these family lines were rarely as clear as nobles pretended. Behind the polished crests and carefully preserved records lay a quiet tangle of secrets, rumors, and unspoken truths that shaped the destinies of entire regions. Inheritance began not with birth, but with uncertainty. A noble family might welcome an heir with great celebration, but beneath the joy lingered questions. Would the child survive infancy? Would rivals challenge the claim? Would the bloodline endure through the unpredictability of life? Every cradle, no matter how finely carved, cast a long shadow into the future. Often, families guarded stories of hidden children, infants born during tumultuous times, spirited away to distant relatives, or raised under assumed identities for safety. A war, a feud, or a change of rulers could place a newborn in sudden danger. And so, some children grew up in cottages far from the lands that were rightfully theirs, hearing only faint hints about their origins. These secrets, held tightly by a few trusted souls, became quiet legacies that only resurfaced when necessity demanded it. Others carried the opposite burden, the weight of a lineage inflated by whispers. A child might be raised believing in noble ancestry that was never fully proven, based on a resemblance, a family tale, or a letter preserved through generations. These claims drifted through marketplaces and manor halls alike, mingling truth with hope. In a world without records, such stories gained strength simply because they were repeated. Marriage, too, was less a union of affection than a careful arrangement of blood and land. Families studied one another like maps, tracing connections through generations. A marriage contract could secure peace, merge fortunes, or prevent long-simmering feuds from igniting into conflict. And yet, behind these formal alliances lay private emotions rarely acknowledged: loyalty, resentment, longing, fear. The newly joined families celebrated publicly, but behind closed doors. They studied each other with cautious eyes, wondering what unspoken legacies they had now inherited. Some families manipulated their genealogies as deftly as merchants balanced their ledgers. A forgotten uncle might be emphasized, a troublesome ancestor conveniently omitted. Old letters could be rediscovered at opportune times. Seals long unused might reappear with remarkable precision. These quiet adjustments were rarely challenged, for few had the means to prove or disprove them. Bloodlines, in their own way, were shaped as much by belief as by birth. For ordinary people, lineage carried a different meaning. They traced their heritage through memories rather than documents. A grandmother's tale, a great-uncle's story, a surname shared with a long-lost cousin in a nearby village. Their legacies were quiet and humble, a field passed down, a craft taught from parent to child, a family story retold by the hearth on winter evenings. These, too, were bloodlines, though rarely written into formal records. They lived in the hearts of families, not in the halls of nobles. When heirs were lost to sickness, to conflict, or simply to the uncertainties of life, entire regions felt the shift. Counselors met in hushed chambers to debate succession. Rivals stepped forward with claims, thought buried. Old oaths resurfaced. And amid the uncertainty, elders whispered stories of hidden descendants, distant branches of the family tree, or forgotten promises made by ancestors long gone. These moments revealed how fragile medieval legacies truly were, dependent not only on birth but on memory, trust, and timing. Some believed that every family carried a quiet legacy, a single truth, known only to a few, passed down like a candle flame across generations. Perhaps it was a secret agreement, a concealed treasure, a vow unbroken despite the turning of centuries. Or perhaps it was simply a story, repeated softly until it became a thread woven into the identity of the family itself. In the end, bloodlines in the medieval world were not straight lines carved in stone, but gentle, winding paths shaped by love, ambition, chance, and silence. The world remembered heirs and titles, but the deeper legacies, the whispered stories, the hidden connections, the choices made in dimly lit chambers shaped history just as profoundly. And so, beneath the banners fluttering over castles and the family crests carved into ancient stone, quiet legacies lived on, carried from generation to generation like small, steady lights glowing through the ever-shifting shadows of time. In the medieval world, danger did not always arrive with clashing swords or thundering armies. Sometimes it came quietly, carried in rumors, in shifting alliances, or in the suspicions of those seeking someone to blame. Entire communities could find themselves suddenly vulnerable, marked not by crime or fault, but by circumstance, difference, or the swelling tide of fear. Yet even in those uncertain times, pathways of protection formed quiet networks shaped by compassion, caution, and the shared understanding that survival often depended on others. These networks rarely announced themselves. They had no symbols, no banners, no visible structure. Instead, they existed in small gestures. A door left unlatched for a traveler who could not return home. A lantern placed in a particular window to signal safety. A warm meal left where a frightened family might find it. People learned to communicate without words, relying on patterns passed from elder to youth, from neighbor to neighbor. These silent practices created threads of connection strong enough to guide entire communities through times of hardship. Merchants played an important role, for they moved freely between towns and villages. Their carts creaked along lonely roads, appearing harmless to those who saw only goods and wares. But beneath bolts of cloth or crates of pottery, some carried messages or small tokens. Signs meant for allies who waited miles away. A scrap of cloth in a certain color, a carved wooden bead, even a folded sheet of parchment without writing could quietly warn or reassure those in hiding. Merchants knew which inns had sympathetic keepers, which crossroads were watched carefully, and which paths offered safer passage under the cover of forest or hillside. In cities, protection often began with whispers. In busy marketplaces, a butcher might nod to a family lingering too long at his stall, signaling them to follow the narrow lane behind his shop. A washerwoman hanging clothes might quietly point to a shutter where someone awaited news. These gestures, subtle enough to be mistaken for daily routine, formed a network of guidance that watched over those who needed it most. No single person knew the whole system, and that was part of its safety. Each participant understood only their own small role, trusting the rest to unseen hands. In rural areas, protection often came through the landscape itself. Forests held paths known only to shepherds and gatherers. Hills contained caves where small groups could rest unnoticed. Simple farmhouses stood at the edges of fields, ready to shelter travelers in need. Families living in these lonely places understood that the land offered both concealment and risk. They listened for unusual sounds. A distant dog barking, footsteps on gravel, the creak of a gate that should have been still. And in those moments, they relied on knowledge passed down through generations to guide strangers toward safety. Monasteries, too, played a quiet part. Though bound by strict rules, many monks believed that compassion outweighed danger. They welcomed the lost and vulnerable with warm bread, fresh water, and a place to sleep within thick stone walls. Some monasteries used coded phrases in their daily routines to indicate when it was safe to enter or when watchful eyes lingered to near. A bell rung at an unexpected hour, a candle placed in a high window, or a psalm sung slightly out of season could convey warnings more effectively than any written message. The persecuted communities themselves learned to adapt. They traveled in small groups or alone, depending on the season and the threat. They carried only what they could afford to lose and memorized routes described to them by those who had passed before. Though fear followed them closely, they found comfort in knowing that hands stretched out, unseen, to guide them from one safe point to the next. Sometimes a journey took days, other times weeks, but each destination brought them closer to places where they could breathe more freely, even if only for a little while. The remarkable thing about these protection networks was that they relied on ordinary people. Farmers, merchants, stonemasons, widows, monks, individuals who gained nothing from their efforts, except the knowledge that they had helped another survive. Their actions were small, but courageous, unrecorded but deeply felt. They navigated a dangerous balance, risking punishment or suspicion from authorities, while offering hope to those who had little left. In times when fear ran high and accusations flowed easily, these networks reminded communities that kindness could move quietly through even the darkest days. They were pathways made not of stone or parchment, but of trust. Fragile, invisible, and resilient. And long after the crises faded, the memories of those quiet acts of protection endured, whispered from one generation to the next, like a gentle promise that no one should face danger alone. Beneath the orderly rhythms of medieval life, the tolling church bells, the measured pace of the fields, the strict rules of nobles and lords, there existed another world entirely. It moved quietly, almost invisibly, beneath the surface of feudal society. This was the shadow market, a vast, unspoken network of exchanges, favors, and whispered agreements that shaped daily life far more than any decree etched in parchment. The shadow market had no stalls, no banners, no official guards. It lived in the spaces between the known and the permitted. A shepherd trading wool for a set of repaired tools without mentioning it to the reeve. A fisherman slipping a portion of his catch to a miller in exchange for grain during a lean season. A mason completing work under moonlight for a noble who wished to avoid attention. These small acts were neither criminal nor entirely lawful. They were simply necessary, woven quietly into the fabric of survival. Villages, especially those distant from lords' manors, developed their own quiet systems. Not every harvest was reported. Not every trade passed through the tax collector's hands. Some exchanges occurred in barns, others in forest clearings, where the scent of pine softened the tension of secrecy. People trusted one another because they had grown up side by side, facing the same winters, the same poor harvests, the same uncertainties. Their agreements were sealed not by ink, but by quiet nods and shared need. Travelers became vital threads in this hidden network. Peddlers with creaking carts, wandering tinkers mending pots, shepherds guiding flocks across regions, all served as carriers of small secrets. They brought news of where cloth could be traded cheaply, which noble overlooked certain tolls, which paths avoided the stricter markets. Their routes wove invisible bridges between villages that had never met, and their memories were often more reliable than any written map. Smugglers also found a place within the shadow market, though they rarely matched the dramatic tales later told about them. Most dealt not in stolen treasure, but in the simple things that made life a little easier. Salt carried quietly across a border to avoid heavy taxes. Herbs gathered from lands claimed by rival lords, or lengths of cloth dyed in shades only permitted to certain classes. Their work required caution and calm, not daring. The goal was never to draw attention, only to keep the quiet flow of goods moving where official channels fell short. Guildsmen, though bound by formal rules, sometimes played both sides. A blacksmith might repair a plow discreetly for a farmer unable to pay guild prices. A weaver might produce a few extra yards of fabric, tucked away beneath ordinary work, intended for a long-time neighbor whose daughter needed a wedding dress. Such favors strengthened communities but had to be kept quiet, for guild oversight was strict and penalties severe. Nobles, despite their power, were not untouched by this hidden economy. Some relied on it more than they admitted. A lord might quietly request that a shipment bypass the main road to avoid attracting rivals' attention. A lady of the manor might pay a healer with gifts rather than coin, asking her to visit without drawing gossip. Even within castle walls, servants exchanged small privileges. An extra loaf, a handful of spices, a length of thread, all part of the silent current that ran beneath the more dignified world above. What made the shadow market remarkable was not its secrecy, but its gentleness. It did not seek to overthrow the established order. It simply softened its sharper edges. When taxes rose too high, the shadow market ensured families did not starve. When guild prices became unreachable, it offered quiet alternatives. When borders shifted and tolls doubled, it found new paths through forest or field. In many ways, it held communities together, during times when official systems faltered under their own weight. At night, the shadow market felt almost alive. Lanterns flickered behind shuttered windows as neighbors exchanged goods with quiet gratitude. Travelers rested in bonds, leaving small tokens of thanks before continuing on their journeys. The soft murmur of whispered bargains drifted through moonlit courtyards and between cottages. Nothing about it felt sinister. Instead, it felt ancient, a simple, human response to a world that was often complicated and uncertain. And though few ever spoke of it openly, everyone knew it existed. It was a gentle undercurrent, steady and enduring, carrying hopes, needs, and kindness across the medieval world. A market without walls, without rules, without recognition, yet one that sustained countless lives through its quiet, resilient presence. For medieval travelers who ventured far beyond familiar borders, the East held a quiet allure, a world softened by lantern light, drifting music, and the gentle murmur of strangers sharing space beneath the night sky. Caravans crossing long stretches of desert or winding through mountain passes often arrived at dusk, just as the first lanterns flickered to life. And in that moment, weary travelers found themselves stepping into something almost dreamlike. The night markets, unlike the bustling daytime bazaars filled with shouting vendors and hurried trade, the night markets unfolded slowly, like a story whispered rather than spoken. Lanterns hung from wooden frames, casting warm halos of gold across cobblestones and silk awnings. The air carried the faint scent of spices, cinnamon, cardamom, warm citrus, drifting gently above the soft hum of voices. Everything moved with a calm rhythm, unhurried and welcoming, as though the market itself understood that travelers needed rest as much as they needed goods. Merchants at the night markets were different from those who filled the streets during the day. They appeared from small doorways, carrying woven baskets or gently lifting the lids of chests filled with carefully protected wares. Their tables were simple, often just mats laid on the ground, yet they displayed objects that felt touched by quiet artistry. Folded silks in deep jewel tones, carved wooden charms, delicate ceramics that glimmered faintly beneath lantern light. Nothing was presented with urgency. Instead, each item waited patiently for wandering eyes to discover it. Performers added their own gentle layer to the night. Musicians sat beneath low-hanging lanterns, coaxing soft, drifting melodies from stringed instruments or small flutes. The music did not command attention. It encouraged stillness. Travelers often found themselves pausing mid-step, listening without meaning to, as if the notes carried stories older than the roads they had traveled. Dancers moved slowly in small circles, their sleeves or scarves trailing behind them like flowing water, each movement deliberate and serene. Food vendors worked quietly at the edges of the market. Their small fires glowed like scattered stars, illuminating steam rising from bowls filled with comforting broths or warm, fragrant rice. A traveler could sit on a low stool, spooning food slowly, watching shadows shift across the market as conversations drifted nearby. In these places, strangers shared tables without the pressure to speak. Silence was not awkward. It was part of the night's gentle rhythm. What made the night market so remarkable was not the trade itself, but the sense of companionship that blossomed beneath the lanterns. People from distant lands mingled without the usual barriers. A merchant from a coastal city might sit beside a shepherd from the mountains, while a scholar traveling alone might share tea with an artisan wrapping up her final sales of the evening. No one asked too many questions. No one boasted or pressed for details. The night markets seemed to encourage a temporary shedding of burdens, a brief rest from the expectations waiting beyond the horizon. Travelers often noticed that these markets had their own unspoken rules. Bargaining was softer, almost playful. Respect was offered without demand. Even the exchange of goods felt different, as if each transaction carried a blessing rather than a price. Local children wandered among the lanterns, offering small tokens, a folded paper charm, a sprig of fragrant herbs, not in expectation of payment, but simply to be part of the night's quiet generosity. As the hours passed, the market shifted subtly. Some lanterns were extinguished, leaving pools of darkness that deepened the remaining light. Musicians slowed their melodies, letting the final notes stretch out like fading ripples across water. Vendors wrapped their goods with the same calm care they had used to unpack them. and travelers, sensing the close of the evening, began to drift back toward inns or caravans, carrying with them small purchases and large, lingering impressions. Long after the last lantern dimmed, the sense of peace remained. For many who journeyed through these lands, the night markets became the quiet heart of their travels, a place where the world felt gentle, where strangers found comfort in shared silence, and where the mysteries of distant cultures were revealed not through grand gestures but through soft light, careful craftsmanship, and the simple act of gathering beneath the night sky. And so, for medieval wanderers, the night markets of the East were not merely places of trade. They were places of tranquility, small, glowing sanctuaries along the winding paths of the world, where even the weariest traveler could pause, breathe, and feel, if only for a moment, entirely at peace. When the medieval world settled into evening, when markets quieted, gates closed, and hearth fires dimmed, a different kind of life awakened. It was not loud or unruly, as later tales sometimes suggested, but gentle, drifting, and deeply human. In the shadows of narrow streets and under lantern-lit balconies, the artists of the night emerged. Poets with soft voices, musicians carrying worn instruments, and courtesans whose presence, despite its complexities, often brought comfort to those who felt the weight of daylight obligations. These night artists were not bound by rigid guilds or strict hierarchies. Their lives flowed with a looser rhythm, guided as much by intuition as by craft. They knew the corners of cities where the echoes softened their songs just right, where candlelight from taverns warmed the air, and where listeners gathered quietly without expectation. Their art did not command grand stages. It blossomed in courtyards, along riverbanks, beneath wooden balconies, and in dimly lit rooms where shadows danced gently on plaster walls. Poets wandered the streets at unhurried paces, murmuring verses inspired by the night stillness. Their words carried the soft cadence of footsteps on cobblestone, weaving images of distant loves, quiet regrets, and moments of fleeting beauty. They performed not to impress, but to soothe. Listeners often leaned against door frames or sat upon worn steps, letting the gentle rise and fall of the poet's voice blur with the sounds of evening. In those moments, time felt suspended, as if the world, wrapped in moonlight, had paused to listen. Musicians, too, found their place in the night. They carried lutes, flutes, small harps, or instruments carved from wood polished by years of playing. They knew melodies that drifted like mist, softening even the tired hearts of travelers who paused to rest. Some played for coins dropped quietly into open cases. Others played for the simple joy of it, letting their music fill the air until it dissolved into the darkness. Their tunes told stories without words, stories of long journeys, changing seasons, unspoken longing, and the comforting repetition of life's familiar rhythms. And then there were the courtesans, whose lives were often misunderstood by those who did not know them. In the night world, they were more than companions. They were keepers of secrets, skilled conversationalists, and bearers of emotional solace. Many had learned music, poetry, or dance, their talents woven naturally into their roles. They offered presence rather than spectacle, creating places where lonely merchants, wandering scholars, or weary officials could set aside their burdens for a little while. Courtesans understood the art of listening. Their rooms were quiet, scented with oils or herbs, lit softly by candles that flickered against silk curtains. Visitors seldom spoke loudly. Instead, conversations unfolded in gentle murmurs. A traveling poet might share a verse he had not dared recite in public. A musician might play a melody he had carried for months without hearing another's response. For these artists of the night, companionship was not merely transaction. It was a momentary meeting of lives crossing in the soft stillness of evening. Small gatherings often formed in secluded courtyards or upper rooms of modest inns. A poet would recite a new verse, a musician would answer with a calming tune, and a courtesan might sway in slow, fluid movements, her dance shaped by the rhythm of the moment. These gatherings were quiet and unrecorded. No scribe wrote down the poems. No painter captured the scenes. Yet to those who attended, they became treasured memories, scenes where art and companionship blurred beautifully into the night. Travelers who encountered these artists carried their impressions to distant lands. They spoke not of grandeur, but of gentleness. How a single flute note hung in the cool air. How a poem made them think of home. How a kind voice helped them forget their worries. Such stories spread slowly, taking on new shapes as they traveled, yet always preserving the essence of the calm and the kindness found in those unseen corners of medieval life. As dawn approached, the artists of the night withdrew quietly. Poets found their way back to humble lodgings. Musicians tucked their instruments beneath cloths. Courtesans extinguished their candles, letting the last glow fade into the soft blue of morning. With the rising sun came the practical world, once more markets, work, duty. But for a few hours each night, the medieval world belonged to the gentle arts, to the voices and melodies that never sought fame, only connection. And long after the lanterns dimmed, their songs and stories lingered like warm breath in cold air, calm, fleeting, and deeply human. In the quietest corners of the medieval world, far from courts, monasteries, and bustling markets, learning often continued long after sunset, while most households slept beneath heavy woolen blankets. A different quietness stirred in hidden chambers, empty workshops, and secluded courtyards. Here gathered the midnight philosophers, small groups of scholars, artisans, scribes, and wanderers who shared a simple longing to understand the world more deeply than daylight allowed. These gatherings were never formal. There were no announcements, no bells, no written invitations. Instead, a single lantern placed above a doorway or set upon a windowsill signaled that a discussion was to be held. Those who noticed the faint glow understood its meaning, drifting toward it with slow, careful steps. They came not as masters or pupils, but as quiet seekers, each bringing a question or an idea tucked gently into the folds of their thoughts. Inside these lantern-lit spaces, the air felt different, thicker, almost as if carrying the weight of curiosity. People spoke softly, their voices blending with the crackle of small fires or the rustling of parchment. The topics were as varied as the travelers who gathered: the motion of stars, the behavior of bees, the shape of distant coastlines, the ethics of rule, the nature of memory. Nothing was too small or too large for consideration. Midnight, in these makeshift schools, opened the mind the way morning opened the sky. Some lantern schools met in the workshops of craftsmen who understood the mechanics of tools better than the theories written in scholarly men. They explained ideas with wood shavings, iron filings, or pieces of clay, shaping lessons from the materials of daily life. A carpenter might describe geometry by carving smooth arcs into soft timber. A potter might demonstrate balance and symmetry with a slowly spinning wheel. Their hands spoke as clearly as their quiet voices. Others gathered in the back rooms of scribes' houses, where shelves bowed under the weight of manuscripts scooped through years of patient labor. These scribes were not philosophers in the traditional sense, yet they carried a treasure that few possessed: access to stories and thoughts from distant lands and long-gone ages. By the glow of a single lantern, they read aloud passages from old works, letting the group sit in silence afterward, absorbing ideas like soil taking in rain. Wanderers, merchants, healers, and pilgrims often contributed tales from their travels. They spoke of customs observed in faraway regions, of strange yet practical solutions to everyday challenges, of small superstitions that shaped the habits of entire villages. Their stories did not pretend to be lessons, yet they broadened the minds of all who listened. Even the simplest observation, shared at midnight, could spark a new chain of thought. The charm of the lantern schools lay not in grand learning, but in gentle exchange. No one corrected harshly. No one competed for prominence. A question posed in one gathering might go unanswered until weeks later, when a traveler returned with a memory or an insight gained from a stranger met on the road. These groups understood that knowledge rarely arrived fully formed. It drifted slowly, gathering shape over time. Many who attended did not think of themselves as scholars at all. Shepherds who watched stars from lonely hillsides came to share what they had noticed about the night sky. Midwives described patterns in the health and temperament of newborns. Fishermen discussed tides they felt more deeply than they could explain. Their experiences added a grounding to the more abstract ideas brought by educated visitors, creating a balance that daylight schools often lacked. The lantern schools seldom grew large, for too many voices would break the fragile tranquility that made them special. Yet they persisted for years, sometimes decades, passed quietly from one generation to the next. An aging philosopher would point to a young apprentice and say softly, "If you wish to learn, look for the lantern on the first clear night after the new moon." And the tradition continued. As dawn approached, the gatherings ended without ceremony. The lantern was extinguished, its small flame surrendering to the pale morning light. Participants returned to their ordinary roles, to the fields, the workshops, the meadows, the narrow adobe houses, carrying with them the calm satisfaction of shared curiosity. In the medieval world, when knowledge often hid behind guarded doors or heavy expectations, the lantern schools offered something gentler. A quiet place where anyone, regardless of birth or rank, could wonder aloud. And though no parchment records their discussions, their spirit lingers in the enduring truth that learning often thrives best in stillness, under soft light, among people who simply wish to understand. Across the medieval world, where borders shifted like restless tides and alliances stretched thin across valleys and mountain ranges, diplomacy unfolded with a patience few modern minds can imagine. It was not a matter of grand speeches or dramatic gestures. Instead, it moved quietly, through letters carried in saddlebags, through gifts wrapped in fine fabrics, through small conversations held behind thick wooden doors. Diplomacy, in its truest medieval form, was more whisper than proclamation. Kings and queens understood that peace was rarely won by force alone. Armies could take land, but only delicate words could keep it, and so courtiers trained in calm observation served as the invisible threads connecting distant realms. They learned to read silences, to notice the meaning behind a seemingly casual remark, to interpret pauses that lasted just a moment too long. These subtle signs often carried more weight than any treaty. Diplomatic messengers traveled slowly, for the roads themselves demanded it. They crossed forests where the winds seemed to carry ancient secrets, passed through villages where curious children peeked at the crests on their cloaks, and stopped at monasteries where monks offered warm broth and simple straw beds. Along the way, these envoys rehearsed their messages quietly, knowing that even one misplaced phrase could shift the course of relations between kingdoms. Upon reaching a foreign court, a messenger entered a world of quiet caution. Great halls might shimmer with tapestries, yet every gesture within them was meticulously measured. A misplaced greeting could hint at disrespect. A gift too lavish could be seen as bribery. A gift immodest could reveal weakness. Diplomats understood the delicate balance, choosing items that reflected careful thought. Polished wooden boxers from forested regions, woven rugs from desert-fringed towns, small sculptures from distant artisans, whose names were unknown, but whose craftsmanship carried meaning. Negotiations themselves seldom unfolded quickly. Weeks might pass with nothing more than shared meals, polite discussions of weather, or leisurely walks through palace gardens. These seemingly idle moments allowed each side to observe the other, to measure temperaments, to gauge intentions, to note how strongly a ruler held to certain positions. Only after trust settled into place like soft morning fog did the deeper conversations begin. Sometimes diplomacy took unexpected forms. A marriage proposal might serve as a bridge between kingdoms, binding two families together in hopes of lasting peace. A rare manuscript sent as a gift could strengthen scholarly ties, encouraging exchanges between monastic libraries. Even shared religious observances, a joint feast day, a pilgrimage undertaken by both rulers could ease long-standing tensions. But not all diplomacy occurred in grand settings. Much of it happened in quieter spaces. A shaded alcove in a palace garden, a balcony overlooking a river, or a small chamber filled with the scent of beeswax and parchment. Here ambassadors and counselors spoke frankly, their words softened by the knowledge that nothing would be written until both sides were ready. In these rooms, treaties were born not from pressure, but from slow, thoughtful conversation. There were missteps, of course. A letter mistranslated, a symbol misunderstood. A messenger delayed by weather could unravel months of patient work. Yet the diplomats rarely responded with anger. Instead, they returned to the conversation, recognizing that misunderstandings were as natural as shifting winds. They approached each new obstacle with the calm persistence that defined their craft. Ordinary people, far from royal courts, sensed the effects of diplomacy only in subtle ways. A market reopened after long closure. A border toll was lowered. A troop movement quietly halted. Farmers noticed when peace settled again over their fields, even if they never knew the details of the negotiations that brought it. The work of diplomats, invisible to most, shaped the rhythm of daily life more than soldiers or monarchs ever could. By night, ambassadors often sat alone in quiet chambers, writing letters by candlelight. Their quills moved slowly across parchment, crafting phrases that would travel hundreds of miles before reaching the hands of their sovereigns. Outside, the world slept, unaware of the delicate threads being woven between kingdoms, threads that might endure for decades or unravel with a single storm. Medieval diplomacy, in all its slowness and care, was not merely a political tool. It was an art of patience, observation, and trust. It taught that peace was not a sudden achievement, but a continuous, gentle effort. A long conversation carried across borders, across seasons, across generations. And though the halls where these whispers once echoed may now stand silent, the essence of their work lingers. A reminder that even in uncertain times, quiet words can shape the fate of nations more deeply than any clash of swords. Thank you, dear friends, for drifting through these shadowed corridors of medieval history with me tonight. We have wandered through secret orders, silent forest rituals, hidden archives, and moonlit marketplaces. And together we have traced the quiet threads of mystery that once shaped a world so distant, yet still strangely familiar. I hope this gentle journey brought you peace, wonder, and a sense of stillness beneath the weight of the past. If tonight's story helped you rest or dream, I invite you to subscribe or return at any time you need a calm escape into another time. For now, let your thoughts soften, let your breath slow, and allow the music to carry you into a peaceful night. The story has ended, and the relaxing music begins now.